What shapes Europe's security? As Munich hosts its annual conference, there are concerns about the continent's future. With the war in Ukraine still raging, how will Europeans face potential security threats? And can they do it alone? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The war in Europe and the new alliances of the future are some of the issues being discussed at one of the most important meetings on the international agenda, the annual Munich Security Conference. Leaders and top officials from the European Union and NATO have been focusing on Ukraine and how the war is shaping their future. While Chinese and American delegations try to resolve the recent diplomatic damage between Beijing and Washington. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, is not attending the conference, but he's dominating most of the discussion. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, reports from Munich.
The conference that takes place every year here in Munich is one of the key points in the US-European security relationship. That relationship has, for 74 years, been defined by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which role was originally to deter any attack from the Soviet Union. That changed rather radically when the Berlin Wall fell and many European countries, Eastern European countries, added to the ranks of NATO members. Then the fears, I think, in Europe of Russia started to subside. Many European countries neglected, the US would say, their defense budget. There was private concern about that in the US. It became very public when Donald Trump became president, fears that Europe wasn't pulling its weight. Well, that, of course, has all changed in the last year since the war in Ukraine, and European leaders, I think, have been much of the driving force for what's gone on in NATO for the first time in the last year. Many of those leaders are saying we need to support President Zelensky incredibly strongly. It's up to him how long this war lasts and when the negotiations start. The message really is for as long as it takes. But I think the US still has a very important role here. It's still the biggest funder of NATO, and in the end, the US election campaign is going to be very important for the war in Ukraine. Presidential elections in just 2 years' time, and a different party, a different president may have a very different view of Ukraine. This is James Bays for Inside Story in Munich.
Let's now welcome our guest. Joining us from Vienna is Wolfgang Pusztai, a security and policy analyst. Wolfgang is a former defense attaché and a senior advisor to the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy. From Taipei, joining us from there is Donnacha, a professor of Dublin City University and author of The Domestic Politics of Post-Soviet Unrecognized States. And over in Oxford, we have Samuel Ramani, who's a defense analyst and associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Warm welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for your time with us on Inside Story. Wolfgang, over in Vienna, on the issue of Ukraine, perhaps this conference is giving Ukraine's allies a chance to assess the war 1 year on. So despite the warm words of support for Kyiv that we've seen, behind the scenes, what would the allies' biggest concerns be when it comes to European security as a whole as this war drags on?
The biggest security for the Europeans is certainly the aggression of Russia. But there is also a concern about the cohesion of the rejection of the Russian adventure in Ukraine. Please be aware that NATO intends to enlarge, that there are 2 northern European countries, Sweden and Finland, which would like to join NATO, and this is blocked by Turkey. So NATO is not that united as it might seem to be.
Okay, Donnacha and Taipei, do you agree with that their unity is being tested, and surely the countries don't all have the same concerns?
No, that's true. And this debate about, a future European, security architecture is not new. It's been going on for some time. I guess it first came in recent times into the forefront when Donald Trump was elected in the United States. There was a fear that the United States was no longer going to be committed in the same way to European security. And then, of course, yes, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has revealed shortcomings really in European security, not least in the ability to produce sufficient ammunition and weapons. Not least, of course, because of the end of the Cold War, but also because of the Euro crisis, because these are democracies. People are always worrying about how their taxes are being spent. And it's difficult for politicians, certainly in peacetime, to argue that defense is worth spending money on over health and education. And what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revealed is that, you know, an authoritarian government which can focus its resources in a much more focused way can be a real danger. And I think Europe, you know, made a fundamental mistake in 2014 in how it responded to the annexation of Crimea. You might say the first invasion of Ukraine that emboldened Vladimir Putin. And 9 years later, they're back at the drawing table trying to see how they can make amends for that and prevent, well, firstly, of course, getting Ukraine to win the war, but then prevent similar occurrences in the future.
Okay, Samuel, weigh in on this, on the security front for Europe. What do you think the challenges are going forward?
Well, I think that there is, just to respond to the comments that we've just heard, a substantial amount of unity in support of Ukraine that we really saw at the Munich Security Conference. It was really telling to see how Germany has gone in 1 year from opposing lethal arms transfers to Ukraine and keeping its defense budget extremely low to supporting more than 2% of GDP on defense spending, and Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, saying we may need even more. So there's been a lot of progress that's come forward. In terms of security challenges, obviously the first and most immediate one is preventing the Russians from achieving renewed military success in Ukraine, and particularly the offensives they're launching in Donbass. So artillery, ammunition, air defense systems, and maybe even down the line fighter jets are essential for Ukraine. The second is on securing some of the candidate states that are coming to the European Union, like Georgia and Moldova, and making sure that they are not vulnerable to Russian aggression. And the third, obviously, is creating a harmonized Northern European security front. That's why resolving the impasse with Turkey over Sweden and Finland is so important. So Sweden and Finland can use their substantial military resources and experience dealing with hybrid threats like cyber to coordinate with the Baltic states and make sure that the northern flank of NATO is as stable as the southern and other flanks of the alliance.
Okay, and Samuel, I'll stick with you for a moment because I'd like you to also comment on what Mr. Donnacha said from Taipei when he was talking about the role of the United States in particular that has been pivotal, and NATO has been the major player when it comes to Ukraine. So do you think that the Europeans can actually rely on themselves going forward, or do they continue to rely on the U.S.?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think that certainly the war in Ukraine has exposed the limitations of Europe's ability to produce military equipment. So we see, for example, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell and other European officials talk about how we may have difficulty producing the amount of ammunition needed to sustain this kind of a long-range war. That's pretty realistic. So in some ways, it's exposed the fact that the Europeans cannot really defend themselves all on their own without America. But European countries are making encouraging investments in their defense budgets that would be suggestive of longer-term autonomy and sustainability. Like I said with Germany, and what we're seeing in particular coming from countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression, like Poland, increasing their GDP to 3% and really consolidating their sources of artillery from countries as diverse as South Korea to NATO. So I think that the Europeans were given a shock, but they're taking gradual and incremental action towards being more autonomous and being able to defend themselves against future threats coming from Russia.
Okay, Wolfgang, over in Vienna, what do you think here? Can Europeans live up to their pledges and take on more responsibility for their own security and move away from the United States?
There is no doubt about it that the Europeans will need to take some more responsibility. This is first and foremost because the focus of the United States has shifted about 10 years ago towards the Pacific. And the current war in Ukraine is a distraction for the United States from their global strategic objective, from their global more important strategic area, from the Pacific. This means there is some kind of burden sharing required between the United States and Europe. This means the conventional defense of Europe will and must in the future rely more on the European armed forces. But it is absolutely correct that countries like Germany need to do much more in the future. There is no doubt about this. Nevertheless, it will still be required to have the support of the United States.
We keep mentioning Germany, but let's look at France for a moment. And Wolfgang, I'll stay with you for this question. France, since the beginning of the war, has been accused of simply not doing enough when it comes to Ukraine. So what is it that prevents France from doing more? Well,
the French military is almost as ground down as the German military. and the main role of defense, of conventional defense in the center of Europe, always rested with the United States and with the Germans. The French have so many global obligations, especially in North Africa, where they are also needed to be. So yes, of course, the French also need to do some more, but they are already have a heavy burden with their presence in North Africa, where they are about to fight terrorism. And this is also an interest of the United States to keep the French in North Africa and to continue to fight terrorism, especially ISIS and the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb there, which is also quite costly. The French maintain also an own nuclear force, and this is also an extremely costly adventure.
Donnacha, if they do indeed increase their defense spending, and we heard from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who's vowing now to, quote, permanently meet NATO's defense spending goal for individual members of 2% of GDP, how do you think the Russians will be looking into this? Because does this reinforce the sentiment amongst Russia that NATO does and will remain an existential threat?
Yes, but of course, Russia, what the European Union and what NATO is doing is responding to Russian aggression. I mean, Russia states its fear of NATO expansion, but it never asks the fundamental question of why NATO has expanded into Central and Eastern Europe. It wasn't that NATO was seeking new members. Essentially, those countries which had been formerly part of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union involuntarily, were banging on the door of NATO, begging for security guarantees to protect them from the historical cycle of abuse that they have received at the hands of the Kremlin over many, many years. And, you know, until Russia changes its action towards its neighbor, there's always going to be a demand for a strong security architecture around Russia to contain it, so to speak. But we sometimes get overawed with Russia as a threat because its threat is entirely military. You know, it has the largest nuclear arsenal, but this war has been illuminating in many respects. It has revealed that, you know, Russia isn't a superpower. Indeed, it's often forgotten that its economy is smaller than Italy's. It's somewhat larger than Spain's. Its GDP per capita is very small. In all the other kind of important benchmarks, Russia is a medium-sized developing power. But what it has done, and this is what dictatorships can do, is that it has focused a lot of those raw materials that it has under the state control into military production. And what Europe hasn't done is it hasn't kept a pace of that. Russia is firing more ammunition in a day than Europe is producing in a month. It's a remarkable statistic. And the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has said that Europe has to pool its resources in the same way that it did, for example, with vaccines during COVID. It has to do the same with ammunition production. But there's no way to respond to this aggression but by essentially making Europe more secure by enhancing its defense production at this stage.
But Donnacha, when the United States also says that the U.S. would have a permanent army base near Poland, I mean, this is not going to be welcome by Russia. How does this help security in the continent?
Well, it helps security by helping the Poles and those other countries in the neighborhood feel more secure. This isn't about just pandering to Russia's security concerns. As I said, we have to ask ourselves, you know, what rights do the countries have bordering Russia? They are not simply buffer states or proxies or pawns. These are sovereign democracies who have elected governments who have a right to choose their own geopolitical alliances. And they have chosen, for very good evidence-based historical and contemporary reasons, to throw in their lot with Europe and with Euro-Atlantic structures. And as I said, that's something that Russia should really examine, why this is happening, rather than seeing it as an aggression towards Russia. It's a response to Russian aggression. And as I said, there's a lot of evidence to prove that over a long period of time.
And Samuel Ramani, if Sweden and Finland actually join NATO, then this would mean that Russia would have NATO on its border. The alliance would have about a 1,300-kilometer border. So Russia's actions could create exactly what Putin didn't want.
Exactly. That's always been the recurrent problem. So when Russia started using hybrid tactics, for example, against countries like Estonia in 2007 with cyber attacks, or the weaponization of energy against Ukraine, it just encouraged Ukraine and Georgia to express interest in NATO membership, precipitating the Russian aggression, the Georgian war, and then the annexation of Crimea in 2014. We're seeing the exact same scenario play out here. Russia invades Ukraine ostensibly to prevent a militantly armed anti-Russian NATO member from emerging on its borders. And all it gets is more NATO expansion on its borders. It's important to keep in mind, too, that there was no political consensus in Sweden and Finland towards abandoning neutrality before this war, and maybe only 20 or 30% of the populations in both countries actually were strong supporters of NATO membership. So Russia's aggression against Ukraine has led to a fundamental shift in these countries' public opinion, has led once again to the expansion of the alliance on its borders.
And Samuel, another significant innovation for European security and defense is that the EU is now, of course, financing the purchase and delivery of lethal weapons to Ukraine. That's a first in EU history, is it not? And how big a game changer is this going forward?
Well, it's an unprecedented step that really just shows the general unity of EU countries around arming Ukraine. Obviously, there's some exceptions like Hungary, which says that it does not want to be a party to the war. And Bulgaria also has intermittently gone back and forth on this because the Socialist Party is much more accommodating towards Russia. But in general, it just shows the degree of EU unity around this. And also, we shouldn't just be looking at the arms transfers. We should also be looking at EU efforts in terms of military training for Ukrainians, because that's also significant in terms of the degree of unity that you're saying. It's not just individual member states like or within NATO, like Britain, leading ad hoc training initiatives that bring other countries together. We're seeing the EU actually invest in this too. And before the war, the Ukrainians made a similar request in 2021 August for this kind of training, and they didn't get it. So in terms of training and arms deliveries, it's a lot of unity that we're seeing coming from the European Union.
Wolfgang, do you agree on that we're seeing a unity in terms of arms delivery and training?
To Russia,
yeah, go ahead.
With regard to Russia, I would say there are two sides of the coin. By no means I don't want to defend the Russian aggression over Ukraine, but we say that each country has, of course, the right to decide if it wants to join the alliance, yes or no. No doubt about this, and I fully agree with this. But on the Russian side, they perceive that this could be a threat for them. They perceive that any basing of NATO missiles or NATO fighter bombers close to their border would allow NATO an aggression over them. And even more important, we say NATO intervened to establish peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo. They say they intervened to fight their own war in Bosnia against the people down there. And they say the same about Kosovo. So for us, it's peace support operation. For the Russians, it's imperialism. I would say it would be important, but right now is not the right moment for this, to build more trust, to build some more trust. And especially if NATO enlargement works, if Sweden and Finland are able to join NATO, and as I said before, this would significantly change the geostrategic situation in Europe, because the Russians would be forced to deploy a very significant number of troops in its northern flank to protect the strategic important harbor of Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, where about half of the nuclear submarines are based. And from an eventual threat by NATO in the case of a Russian aggression in Central Europe. So this means if the northern countries would join NATO and Russian aggression in Central Europe would be much more risky. And I'm sure that the Russians would have much less appetite for military aggression against NATO. And this situation could be also used to build some more trust again by having some inspections on both sides of the border and by having some common activities. So yes, the Russians are the ones who are the aggressors. There is no doubt about it. But it's all about perceptions, and it would be necessary also to take into account their concerns.
Mr. Donnacha in Taipei, would you like to comment on what we just heard from Vienna?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a consensus in Europe at the moment that it's not foreseeable that you could make a deal with the current Russian administration that would be enduring. You have to remember that deals have been struck in the past with this administration and indeed with Russia. I mean, we go back even to 1994 when the Russian Federation guaranteed the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, the independence of Ukraine in a binding agreement. And of course, that has been flagrantly ignored since then. So I think that's the big fear in Ukraine and indeed within the European Union, that there isn't a partner at the moment to establish this trust and on which to build kind of a common understanding. Indeed, Europe has tried that in the past. The whole idea of Nord Stream and economic engagement was that somehow Russia could be changed through economic engagement. And in fact, what has been revealed is that it was the Kremlin which was using economic engagement to further its objectives. And it had kind of lulled itself into the belief that Europe was sufficiently dependent and divided that it wouldn't act robustly if Russia further extended its invasion into Ukraine. In that, it has proved fundamentally wrong. But as you know, I mean, I'm speaking here from Taiwan, and there are other parts of the world who also have a vested interest in seeing Ukraine win and Russia's invasion be defeated, because if Putin gains something from this, if Russia gains something from this invasion, it will send a signal not only to Putin and to Russia, but to other authoritarian states that military aggression pays. So there has to be accountability.
I'm glad you bring that up. Let me just put this to you, Mr. Donnacha, because we heard from the NATO Secretary General who said this: what is happening in Europe today could happen in Asia tomorrow. To what extent do you think the Europeans and NATO are concerned about any potential, let's say, cooperation between China and Russia going forward?
Yeah, they are very concerned. And indeed, Secretary of State Antony Blinken made this clear, where he was saying that there was a real threat of China providing military aid to Russia, because ultimately, China has tried to hedge its bet, but China doesn't want to see Russia lose in this battle. And that's where there's a fundamental disagreement between China and the West on the outcome of this conflict. And there are obvious parallels between somewhere like Taiwan. You have an authoritarian China, increasingly repressive at home and aggressive abroad. It's a dictatorship versus democracy, of course, here in Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is considered an integral part of China in a similar parallel way that Russia sees Ukraine as kind of part of its legitimate interest, its sphere of influence. So how the West responds to Russia's invasion of Ukraine will have a domino effect in other parts of the world. There's no doubt about that. So while there's a lot at stake, European security, the future of Ukraine, in the outcome of this war, it's not confined to those areas. It's actually of global significance.
Samuel, behind the scenes, though, do you think that governments will be questioning the extent and duration of their involvement, particularly as economic pressures grow? Europe is having to pay a high price. There's high inflation, increased gas costs, of course, the issue of refugees as well.
So far, we've seen the economic costs of the war, like the inflation, energy prices, and rising food prices, for example, be much less of a deterrent for support to Ukraine than many people predicted. It's also notable that populist candidates who ran on platforms about reining in support for Ukraine and also not having a gas embargo against Russia, like Marine Le Pen in France, were soundly defeated, whereas other candidates who have supported arming Ukraine, like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, have been successful. So I don't think that those economic pressures are really going to, in the short term, limit Western support for Ukraine. But obviously, there are disagreements on two key areas. The first is on long-range missiles, and the second is to do with fighter jets. So we've seen Britain, particularly led by Rishi Sunak, be pretty vocal on both of these issues in support of them, and Poland also be supportive of this. But even within Britain, for example, Ben Wallace has a very different view. He thinks that Eurofighter Typhoon jets can only be delivered after the war, whereas Sunak was more open to having them being delivered during it. And other countries like Germany are probably going to be less willing to give that kind of equipment. So the disagreement is less going to be on whether we support Ukraine in terms of ammunition, artillery, and helping them economically also hold up against the infrastructure strikes and Russian aggression. It's going to be more about those escalation risks, the long-range missiles, the fighter jets, and the more the West dithers on that, the longer this war is going to take, and the more Ukrainians die.
Let's bring in Wolfgang, because I see you shaking your head, Wolfgang. I mean, will European countries find it politically challenging to spend more on defense when faced with an economic downturn?
Well, the voters will ask the politicians to justify this. But let me have a brief point on the delivery of fighter jets to Ukraine. To build up an air force with a 4.5 generation fighter jet like the Eurofighter Typhoon takes years. So this means there is no way that the first Eurofighter squadron would be operational in Ukraine before in, let's say, at best, in 2 or 3 years. So this is not like an anti-tank missile or not like a tank that could be operational in a couple of months. We are talking about years. So it's really worth the question to ask, is this right now the priority? I don't think it is, because it will be simply not available in time. But there is also no doubt about this. If the war is frozen or if there is a ceasefire, it would be necessary to re-establish also the air force of the Ukrainians. And this is certainly something where the Western fighter jets need to come to Ukraine.
Okay, Mr. Donnacha, I mean, what is the way forward, do you think?
Well, I think there's been a transformation in how we understand security in Europe since Russia's invasion. I think one of the I mean, it's been mentioned about Germany. I mean, Germany up until this point had been the most reticent in adopting a robust response to Russia's invasion. They have changed so much in 1 year, and I think that's emblematic of the changes in thinking that have occurred. And I think one of the big takeaways is that geography matters, but more than geography, values matter. And that's why I mentioned the issue of democracies versus dictatorship. This is a fundamental schism in Europe. We've been down this road before of how to organize European society along the lines of a dictatorship or a democracy. So there's only one path that Europe can take. There's only one key takeaway from that. Democracy is worth defending, and therefore it's worth investing in. And that's not confined to Europe. As I said, it's not based just on geography. It's based on the neighborhood is based on values.
Okay, we have 2 minutes remaining. Wolfgang, you can comment.
Well, I would say the first priority is always security. After security, it is a precondition for the economy, for economic interests. And thereafter, it's about values. If you don't have security, if you don't have economic prosperity, you cannot further your values. Let me say last sentence. This is the first Munich conference in a new age. The age of globalization is over for Europe, and there is no more peaceful cooperation with Russia whatsoever.
Okay, Samuel, a final word to you. What lessons can be learned from this, and what's the way forward?
I think that obviously there needs to be a lot of solidarity, I think, towards Ukraine to prevent a kind of repeat situation inside Asia. And hopefully this Munich Security Conference leads to a more of a long-term coordination, and the domestic political pressures do not kind of really blur with national security the way it's so often done in the past with regards to Russia.
Just one more question to you, Samuel. Do you think that Ukraine will join the European Union?
Well, I think it's got a long path to it. I think they've become candidates, but it's going to be a long way towards direct membership. So maybe some kind of an informal agreement between them that leads to greater economic integration is probably more likely. So I think it's a long-term process.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Wolfgang Pusztai, Donnacha Beacháin, and Samuel Ramani. We thank you for your time. Thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself, the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.